The sound it made will haunt me forever. It was not a clean crack, not a simple snap of wood. It was a splintering, shrieking crunch, a symphony of destruction that echoed in the small, quiet space of my living room. It was the sound of 150 years of history, of music, of love, being obliterated against the unforgiving leg of a solid oak coffee table. My daughter-in-law, Veronica, stood over the wreckage, her chest heaving, her face a mask of furious triumph. "There," she spat, her voice dripping with venom. "Finally got rid of some of this old trash." And in that moment, something inside me, something that had been dormant for years, broke just as surely as the violin had. She had no idea what she had just done. And I, in that instant of profound, soul-crushing silence, made a quiet decision. She would find out. It all began, as it so often did, with an unannounced visit. I was sitting in my favorite armchair, the worn leather cool against my back, lost in a memory. The afternoon sun slanted through the window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air like tiny, silent ballerinas. In my hands, I held the violin. I wasn't playing it, just holding it. The polished wood, a deep, rich umber that seemed to glow from within, was smooth and familiar beneath my fingertips. I traced the elegant curve of the F-holes, my thumb brushing over the spot on the neck, worn smooth by generations of musicians, and by my own hand. It smelled faintly of rosin, old wood, and, to me, of my late wife, Eleanor. Eleanor had given it to me. It was our 30th anniversary. I was a hobbyist, a man who found solace in the soaring notes of Bach and the melancholy refrains of folk tunes. I'd always played on a serviceable student-grade instrument, but Eleanor, a history professor with a love for hidden stories, had found this one in a dusty little antique shop in Prague during one of her research trips. It was a rescue, she'd said. It had a soul, and it needed someone to let it sing again. She had paid a sum that seemed astronomical to us at the time, a secret she kept tucked away until she presented it to me, her eyes shining with a love that was as deep and resonant as the violin's own voice. The doorbell rang, a shrill, impatient buzz that shattered the peace of the afternoon. I sighed, carefully placing the violin back in its plush, velvet-lined case. I already knew who it was. Only Veronica rang the bell like she was trying to start a fire. I opened the door to find her standing there, arms crossed, a designer handbag perched on her arm like a well-trained falcon. Beside her, my son, Thomas, gave me a weak, apologetic smile. And behind them, my grandson, Leo, was already engrossed in a game on his phone, oblivious to the world. "Arthur," Veronica said, her tone clipped. It was never Dad or Father, just Arthur. She swept past me into the apartment, her nose wrinkling almost immediately. "Honestly, this place, it has a smell. It's like a museum, but without the funding." "It's called books, Veronica," I said, my voice mild. "And old wood. It's a pleasant smell." "It's a musty smell," she corrected, running a manicured finger along a bookshelf and inspecting it for dust. She found none, which seemed to disappoint her. "Thomas, why don't you open a window? It's suffocating in here." Thomas, ever the peacekeeper, scurried to do her bidding, fumbling with the latch on the old sash window. He was a good man, my son, but he was a ship without a rudder, tossed about on the turbulent seas of his wife's whims. He loved me, I knew he did, but he was terrified of Veronica's displeasure. He had long ago decided that the path of least resistance was the only one worth taking. "Grandpa," Leo said, not looking up from his screen, "is your Wi-Fi always this slow? I can't connect to my game server." "Hello to you too, Leo," I said, a familiar ache in my chest. "I don't have Wi-Fi. I have a cable." Leo groaned dramatically. "Ugh, it's like the Dark Ages." "Exactly," Veronica chimed in, seizing the opportunity. "That's what I'm always telling Thomas. Your father is stuck in the past. This whole apartment is a relic. It's unhealthy, all this clutter." Her eyes, sharp and critical, scanned the room. My clutter consisted of shelves overflowing with books, stacks of sheet music, a few framed photographs of Eleanor, and my music stand, which stood beside my armchair. And next to it, the violin case. Her gaze landed on the case like a predator spotting its prey. And that thing, she said, gesturing towards it with a dismissive flick of her wrist. You're still fiddling with that old thing? The noise gives me a headache, and it just adds to the mess. I felt a familiar prickle of defensiveness. It's not a thing, Veronica. It's a violin, and it was a gift from Eleanor. Yes, we all know the story, she sighed, waving a hand as if to bat away the memory of my wife. The casual disrespect was a physical blow. Eleanor was a lovely woman, but she was a romantic. She wouldn't want you living in a shrine to the past. It's time to modernize, to clear things out. This was the true purpose of their visit, I realized. It was another campaign in her long-running war to get me to sell my apartment and move into a modern, managed living facility, which was her euphemism for a sterile box where old people were sent to be forgotten. She coveted the real estate. My modest two-bedroom apartment was in a pre-war building, in a neighborhood that had become aggressively fashionable. The sale would net a small fortune, a fortune she no doubt already had plans for. A new car, a kitchen renovation, another ludicrously expensive handbag. I'm not selling, Veronica, I said, my voice firm. We've been over this. This is my home. It's a dusty, oversized liability, she countered, and you're not getting any younger. What if you fall? There's no one here to help you. I'm perfectly capable of looking after myself, I said, my patience beginning to fray. Are you? She challenged, her voice rising. You spend your days cooped up in here with your dead wife's junk, scraping away on that piece of firewood. Something inside me snapped. The casual cruelty, the deliberate, targeted insult to both me and Eleanor's memory. It was too much. You will not speak about my wife that way, I said, my voice low and shaking, with a rage I rarely felt. And you will not speak about this violin that way. You have no idea what it means. Oh, I know what it means, she shrieked, her carefully constructed facade of bored superiority cracking to reveal the ugly, grasping fury beneath. It means you're stubborn. It means you'd rather live in this mausoleum than think about your family's future, about Leo's future. She was marching towards the violin case as she spoke. I started to rise from my chair, a cold dread washing over me. Veronica, don't. Thomas, seeing the situation escalating, finally spoke up. Honey, maybe we should just calm down. Let's go. No, she yelled, ignoring him completely. She reached the case and flipped open the latches with a violent flick of her wrists. She grabbed the violin by its neck, yanking it from its velvet bed. This is the problem, she screamed, holding it aloft like a weapon. This obsession with the past. This is just a stupid, worthless piece of wood. Veronica, put it down, I yelled, my voice raw. I was on my feet now, moving towards her, but it felt like I was wading through mud. My heart was hammering against my ribs. Leo had finally looked up from his phone, his eyes wide. Thomas was frozen, his mouth agape, paralyzed by indecision. You need to let go of this trash, she howled, and with a final guttural cry of pure, unadulterated rage, she swung the violin with all her might. She brought it down against the corner of my heavy oak coffee table. The sound, that terrible, final, splintering crunch. The neck snapped. The body, that beautiful, resonant body, shattered into a dozen pieces. Strings coiled and sprang loose like dying snakes. The bridge flew across the room, ricocheting off a bookshelf. A cloud of ancient wood dust puffed into the air. Silence fell. A heavy, profound silence, broken only by Veronica's ragged breathing. She stared at the wreckage at her feet, a sliver of the polished scroll still clutched in her hand. A look of dawning, horrified realization began to creep into her eyes, but it was quickly replaced by a renewed flash of defiance. There, she said again, her voice trembling, but still laced with that awful, self-righteous anger. It's done. Now maybe you can finally move on. I didn't say a word. I couldn't. I walked slowly past her, past my stunned and silent son, and knelt on the floor. My hands hovered over the pieces, afraid to touch them, as if they were the remains of a living thing. The smooth, lustrous varnish was fractured into a spiderweb of cracks. The delicate purfling was splintered. I saw the maker's label, visible through the shattered F-hole, torn in two. I looked up at her. My gaze was flat, empty of everything but a cold, hard clarity. The grief was there, a vast black ocean of it, but on its surface, a single sharp thought floated like a shard of ice. This was not the end. This was the beginning. "Get out," I said. My voice was quiet, almost a whisper, but it cut through the silence like a razor. "Arthur, she started, the bluster finally failing her. "Get out of my house," I repeated, enunciating each word with chilling precision. Thomas finally found his voice. "Dad, I'm so sorry. She didn't mean it. She lost her temper." I didn't look at him. My eyes were locked on Veronica. "Take your wife and your son and leave," I said. "Now." There was something in my voice, something they had never heard before, that finally broke through their paralysis. Thomas grabbed Veronica's arm, pulling her towards the door. She stumbled, casting one last frightened look at me, at the ruin on the floor. Leo, for once, was silent, his face pale. They left. The door clicked shut behind them, and I was alone with the ghost of the music. I stayed there on my knees for a long time, the afternoon sun moving across the floor, the dust motes settling on the wreckage. I didn't cry. The pain was too deep for tears. It was a hollow, aching void where the music used to be. But in that void, a seed of resolve was planted. A cold, hard, and utterly immovable resolve. Veronica had called it trash. She had called it a worthless piece of wood. She believed she had destroyed something of sentimental value. She was wrong. She had destroyed a masterpiece, and she was going to pay for every last splinter. The hours after they left passed in a blur of surreal quiet. The silence in the apartment was different now. It was no longer the comfortable, companionable silence of a man at peace in his own home. It was a heavy, oppressive silence, the kind that follows a sudden, violent death. The air itself felt thick with loss. I remained on the floor, surrounded by the debris of what had once been my most treasured possession. Each jagged piece of wood was a fresh wound. The scroll, miraculously intact but detached, lay on its side, like a severed head. The delicate chin rest had been flung under the armchair. The main body of the instrument was a catastrophe, a jigsaw puzzle of devastation. Slowly, methodically, I began to gather the pieces. My hands trembled, not with age, but with a grief so profound, it felt like a physical illness. I picked up a large fragment of the belly, the wood so thin and fragile. I could see the intricate grain, the masterful carving that had been invisible to the casual eye. This was not just wood. It was the culmination of a luthier's life's work, a vessel designed for the sole purpose of creating beauty. And now it was just debris. I used a soft brush from my desk drawer to sweep up the tiniest splinters and the fine powder of ancient varnish, collecting every last particle on a sheet of paper. I couldn't bear the thought of even a speck of it being lost to the vacuum cleaner. I laid all the pieces out on the dining table, arranging them in a vague approximation of their original form. It was a forensic reconstruction of a murder. Looking at it, laid bare under the lamp's glow, the full weight of Veronica's action crashed down on me. This wasn't just an act of anger. It was an act of profound violation. She hadn't just broken an object. She had attacked a part of my soul. She had taken a symbol of my love for Eleanor and smashed it out of spite and greed. As I stared at the wreckage, my mind began to drift back, connecting the dots of a long and wearying history. This wasn't the first time Veronica had shown her disdain for my life, for my memories. It was simply the most violent and final expression of it. I remembered the first time Thomas brought her home. She had surveyed my apartment with the same critical, dismissive air, her comments disguised as well-meaning suggestions. "A little bit of paint could really brighten this place up," she'd said, implying it was a dungeon. "Have you ever thought about getting rid of some of these old books? You could put a lovely modern art print there." I remembered the Christmas she'd gifted me a digital photo frame, preloaded with pictures of her, Thomas, and Leo. "So you can replace some of these old-fashioned frames," she'd announced cheerfully, her eyes flicking pointedly towards the silver-framed photo of Eleanor and me on our wedding day. I had thanked her politely and put the digital frame back in its box, where it remained to this day, buried in a closet. I recalled the endless arguments about money. She and Thomas lived a life far beyond their means, A life of leased luxury cars, expensive holidays, and designer clothes for a child who would outgrow them in 6 months. They were perpetually in debt, a fact Veronica blamed not on her own profligacy, but on my refusal to release the equity in my home. To her, my home, my life, my memories were not things to be respected. They were assets to be liquidated. She saw me not as a father or a grandfather, but as a stubborn old man sitting on a pot of gold she felt entitled to. The violin had always been a particular point of contention. She hated the sound of my practicing. "Can't you just wear headphones?" she'd once asked, completely ignorant of how a string instrument works. She saw it as a symbol of my refusal to move on, to erase the past, to erase Eleanor. In her mind, the violin was a rival for my attention and, more importantly, a rival for the space and money she coveted. This final, violent act was the culmination of all that simmering resentment. It was a power play, a brutal and desperate attempt to break my will, to shatter my connection to my own life so she could remold it to her liking. A new feeling began to crystallize within me, pushing aside the initial shock and grief. It was anger, a cold, clear, and focused anger. It wasn't the hot, explosive rage that had driven Veronica. It was a deep, glacial fury. She had wanted to break me. She had succeeded in breaking my heart, but she had failed to break my spirit. In fact, she had forged it into something new, something hard and unyielding. My gaze fell upon the old cedar chest that sat under the window. It had been Eleanor's. It was where she kept her most important papers, her academic accolades, her correspondence. It was also where, I now remembered with a jolt, she had placed the documents for the violin. I hadn't looked at them in years. I knelt before the chest, the scent of cedar and old paper rising as I lifted the heavy lid. Inside, everything was just as she had left it. Her doctoral hood, neatly folded, bundles of letters tied with faded ribbon. And there, in a large manila envelope, was a file labeled simply, "The Prague Violin." My hands trembled as I opened the clasp. Inside was a bill of sale, written in Czech and German, from the Prague antique dealer. There was a letter of provenance, tracing the instrument's ownership back through 2 world wars, through the hands of a concertmaster in the Vienna Philharmonic, to a noble family in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And then I saw it. The document I had forgotten even existed. It was an appraisal, conducted at Eleanor's request by a renowned firm in London, before she had even brought it home. She had wanted to insure it for the journey. I unfolded the thick, watermarked paper. My eyes scanned the detailed description, the precise measurements, the analysis of the varnish, the description of the wood grain, a single piece of beautifully flamed maple for the back. And then I saw the conclusion. Based on the physical characteristics, the maker's label, which we believe to be authentic, and the instrument's unique tonal properties, it is our expert opinion that this violin is a fine and well-preserved example of the work of luthier Bartolomeo Giuseppe Guarneri del Gesù, crafted circa 1741. Guarneri del Gesù. The name hit me like a physical blow. I was a hobbyist, but even I knew that name. He was the only luthier whose instruments were considered the equal, and by some, the superior, of Antonio Stradivari. His creations were legendary, known for their powerful, dark, and complex tones. There were fewer than 200 of them known to exist. My eyes scanned down to the bottom of the page, to the valuation figure. It was dated over a decade ago. Even then, the number was staggering. I sat back on my heels, the paper shaking in my hand. Eleanor had known. She had known she wasn't just buying me a beautiful old violin. She was giving me a piece of history, a priceless masterpiece. She had never told me its true identity or value. She had wanted me to love it for its voice, not for its price tag. She knew I would have been too intimidated to even play it. It was an act of pure, selfless love. And Veronica had smashed it. She had smashed a Guarneri del Gesù violin against a coffee table because she thought it was trash. The cold anger in my chest solidified into something else entirely. It was a sense of purpose, a mission. The grief for the instrument was still there, a raw and open wound. But now it was coupled with a righteous fury that was as clear and bright as a flame. I carefully placed the documents back in the envelope. I closed the cedar chest. I stood up and walked back to the dining table, looking at the pathetic, shattered remains of a king. Veronica had wanted me to move on. She had wanted me to clear things out. Oh, I would, but not in the way she imagined. She had started a war over a piece of worthless firewood. I was going to finish it over a national treasure. I picked up my phone. I didn't call Thomas. I didn't call a friend. I scrolled through my contacts until I found a number I hadn't used in years. Arthur Jensen, a retired litigator from my old firm, a man known for his sharp mind and even sharper tongue. He owed me a favor. It was time to collect. The quiet decision made in the immediate aftermath of the destruction had now found its voice. It was no longer just a feeling. It was a plan. The next morning, I woke before the sun. I hadn't really slept, but had drifted in a state of agitated limbo, the image of the violin shattering, replaying in my mind, on an endless loop. But with the first gray light of dawn, the despair had receded, leaving behind the hard bedrock of my resolve. I made coffee, the familiar ritual, a small anchor in the storm of my emotions. I drank it standing by the dining table, looking at the tragic tableau of wood and wire. My first call was not to the litigator. It was to a man named Julian Croft. His name was on a business card tucked into the file with the appraisal documents. Julian Croft, Luthiery and Fine Instrument Appraisal. He was the expert who had originally authenticated the violin for Eleanor in London. A quick search online revealed he was still in business, now operating his own prestigious firm. He was considered one of the foremost experts in the world on Cremonese instruments. I dialed the international number, my heart pounding a nervous rhythm against my ribs. A crisp, British voice answered, "Croft & Son, how may I help you?" "I'd like to speak with Mr. Julian Croft, please," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "My name is Arthur Vance. It's regarding a Guarneri del Gesù violin he appraised some years ago." There was a pause on the other end of the line. The name Guarneri was clearly a password that opened doors. "One moment, sir." A few seconds later, a warm, cultured voice came on the line. "Julian Croft speaking." I took a deep breath. "Mr. Croft, my name is Arthur Vance. My late wife, Eleanor, consulted you about a violin she purchased in Prague over a decade ago. You identified it as a Guarneri from 1741. "Ah, yes, I remember it vividly," he said, his voice filled with genuine enthusiasm. "The Prague Guarneri," I called it. A magnificent instrument. The varnish, the sound. Utterly breathtaking. A dark, powerful G-string, I recall. "How is it playing, Mr. Vance?" The question was a knife in the gut. "That's why I'm calling, Mr. Croft," I said, my voice catching for the first time. "There's been an incident. The violin has been destroyed." The silence on the other end of the line was absolute. It stretched for a full 10 seconds. When he finally spoke, all the warmth was gone from his voice, replaced by a tone of shocked, almost pained disbelief. "Destroyed? What do you mean, destroyed?" "I mean it is in pieces," I said bluntly. "Smashed, irreparably." I could hear him take a sharp intake of breath. "My God," he whispered. "That's not just a tragedy, Mr. Vance. That's a crime against culture, against history. How did it happen?" "It was an act of domestic violence," I said, the words tasting like ash. "And I need your help. I need a formal current valuation of the instrument in its prior condition, and I need a professional assessment of its current state, as wreckage. I need it for legal purposes." "Of course," he said immediately, his voice now a mixture of professional focus and personal outrage. "Whatever you need. This is an abomination. We can't have people destroying works of art like that with impunity. Where are you located?" I told him my city. "I'll be on the next flight," he said without a moment's hesitation. A Del Gesù is not just another violin. It's a member of a very small, very elite family of instruments. When one is lost, the entire musical world feels it. I will bring my equipment. Do not touch the pieces. Do not try to clean them. Photograph everything as it is. I will be there within 48 hours. Hanging up the phone, I felt a surge of validation. His reaction, the sheer horror and anger in his voice, affirmed the magnitude of what had happened. This wasn't just my personal loss anymore. It was, as he said, a crime against culture. My next call was to Arthur Jensen, the lawyer. He was in his late 70s now, but his mind was as sharp as a tack. I had helped his wife through a difficult illness years ago, staying by her side when he was stuck in a lengthy trial. He had told me then, "Anything you ever need, Arthur, anything." I was now calling in that marker. "Jensen," he barked into the phone. "Arthur Jensen, it's Arthur Vance." His tone softened immediately. "Vance, my God, it's been an age. How are you? Is everything all right?" "Not exactly," I said, and for the next 15 minutes, I laid out the entire story. The history of the violin, Eleanor's gift, Veronica's long campaign of attrition, and the final, violent act of destruction. I told him about the original appraisal and the impending visit from Julian Croft. Jensen listened without interruption, a skill that had made him a fearsome litigator. When I finished, there was a long pause. "So, let me get this straight," he said, his voice a low growl. "Your daughter-in-law, in a fit of pique over you not wanting to sell your home to fund her shopping habits, willfully destroyed what is likely a multi-million-dollar work of art?" "That's the sum of it, yes," I replied, "and she called it trash?" "And firewood," I added. I could almost hear the grim smile forming on his face. "Oh, this is beautiful," he murmured. "This is poetic. The sheer, unadulterated hubris. It's a lawyer's dream." "It's my nightmare," I reminded him. Of course," he said, his tone becoming serious. "I'm sorry, Arthur. This is a terrible thing. A truly terrible thing. But from a legal standpoint, it is a fortress. We are not talking about sentimental value, which is hard to quantify. We are talking about the destruction of a tangible, identifiable, and extraordinarily valuable asset. This is no different than if she'd taken a sledgehammer to a Picasso." "So, what do we do?" I asked. We do nothing, for now," he said. "We wait for your man from London. We get his report. We get a formal, updated, ironclad valuation. We document everything, and then we present them with a bill. Not a lawsuit, not yet. A simple, straightforward demand for restitution. And we do it in a way that gives them absolutely no room to maneuver." "And Thomas?" I asked, the question heavy with a father's pain. "He's my son." Jensen's voice was gentle but firm. "He stood there and let it happen, Arthur. He is married to her. In the eyes of the law, and in the eyes of their shared finances, he is just as liable. He made his choice. Now he has to live with the consequences. Our target is Veronica, but he is inextricably linked. You need to prepare yourself for that." He was right. Thomas had made 1,000 small choices over the years, all of which led to that moment where he stood by, silent and ineffective, while his wife destroyed a piece of my heart. My love for him was a deep and painful ache, but it could not be a shield for them. Not this time. For the next 2 days, I lived in a state of suspended animation. I followed Julian Croft's instructions to the letter, taking dozens of high-resolution photographs of the wreckage from every conceivable angle. I documented the scene of the crime, the coffee table with its dented oak leg, the scattered pieces, the silent, empty violin case. I acted like a detective, my grief channeled into a cold, methodical process. During this time, my phone rang several times. It was Thomas. I didn't answer. He left voicemails. The first was flustered, apologetic. "Dad, please call me. I am so sorry. Veronica feels terrible. She wants to apologize. She wasn't thinking." The second was more frustrated. "Dad, ignoring me isn't going to solve anything. We need to talk about this. Veronica is a mess. She bought you a new violin online, a really nice one. It's on its way. A new violin online." Ooh. The sheer, insulting ignorance of that statement was staggering. It was like offering a child's crayon drawing to replace a stolen Rembrandt. I deleted the messages without a second thought. Then came a text from a number I didn't recognize. "Arthur, this is Veronica. I know you're angry, but you're being childish. I've apologized. Thomas told you I ordered you a replacement, a very expensive one. There's no reason to be dramatic. We can put this behind us. No remorse, no understanding, just annoyance that I wasn't complying with her desire to sweep her mess under the rug. Her arrogance was breathtaking. She was still operating under the assumption that she held all the power, that my anger was a temporary inconvenience she could manage and dismiss. She had no idea of the avalanche that was about to come crashing down on her perfectly curated life. I saved the text. It was evidence. On the third day, Julian Croft arrived. He was a tall, slender man in his 60s, with kind eyes that sharpened with intensity when he looked at the violin. He carried a set of specialized aluminum cases. He greeted me with a firm handshake and a somber expression. "Mr. Vance, I am so deeply sorry for your loss." I led him to the dining table. He stood over the arranged pieces for a long time, his hands clasped behind his back, his expression a mixture of a doctor examining a terminal patient and a priest administering last rites. "An execution," he murmured, his voice filled with a quiet fury. "A bloody execution." For the next 5 hours he worked. He donned white cotton gloves and a pair of magnifying spectacles. He meticulously examined each piece, taking measurements, photographing wood grain under a portable microscopic lens, and making notes in a leather-bound book. He worked with a reverence and focus that was deeply moving. He was treating these broken shards of wood with more respect than Veronica had ever shown me in my entire life. "The damage is catastrophic," he said, finally looking up at me, his face grim. "There is no possibility of restoration. A lesser instrument, perhaps, but a Guarneri's value is in its originality, its tonal integrity. That has been annihilated. It can be glued back together to resemble a violin, but it will only ever be a ghost, a scar. Its voice is silenced forever." He paused, removing his spectacles. "However, for the purposes of valuation, I can state unequivocally, based on my original assessment and what I can still analyze from the remains, that this was, without a shadow of a doubt, the Prague del Gesù, circa 1741, a sister instrument to the Vieux Temps and the Il Canon. In its condition before this event, its market value would be significant." "How significant?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He looked at me directly. "The market for these instruments has exploded since Eleanor first brought it to me. They are seen as better investments than fine art or real estate by many collectors and foundations. Given its provenance, its condition, and recent sales of comparable instruments, a conservative auction estimate would be in the region of $2.2 million. $2.2 million. The number hung in the air between us, so vast and unreal it seemed to suck all the oxygen from the room. I sank into a chair, my head spinning. I had known it was valuable. I had not conceived of that level of value. I had been living with, playing, and loving a treasure on par with a small Monet or a Da Vinci sketch. Julian packed his equipment in silence. Before he left, he placed a hand on my shoulder. "Mr. Vance," he said, his voice firm, "Eleanor gave you a gift of unimaginable beauty. What was done to it was an act of barbarism. Do not let it stand, for Eleanor's sake and for the sake of the music that was lost." I nodded, unable to speak. After he was gone, I sat alone in the quiet apartment, the number echoing in my mind. $2,200,000. It wasn't about the money. It was about the scale of the violation. The breathtaking arrogance of destroying something so precious out of sheer ignorant spite. Veronica thought she had smashed a $50 flea market fiddle. She thought her very expensive online replacement would smooth things over. She thought my anger was childish drama. I picked up the phone and called Arthur Jensen. "I have the number," I said. The plan, as devised by Arthur Jensen, was one of beautiful, surgical simplicity. It was not a declaration of war, but a quiet, formal summons. He drafted a letter on his heavy, cream-colored letterhead, the kind that felt important even before you read the words. It was addressed to Mr. and Mrs. Thomas Vance. The letter was polite, professional, and utterly chilling. It stated that I, his client, had retained his services regarding the unfortunate incident that occurred on a specific date, resulting in the total and irreparable destruction of a valuable personal possession. It requested their presence at his office at a specific time and date, a week hence, for a mediation session to discuss a resolution and avoid further legal action. "The key is the tone," Jensen had explained to me over the phone. "It's not aggressive, it's procedural. It suggests that this is a standard, albeit serious, matter to be resolved between reasonable parties. It will lull them into a false sense of security. Veronica will assume she can bully her way through it. She'll see it as an inconvenience, not a threat. He was right. 2 days after the letter was sent by courier, Thomas called me. His voice was a mixture of exasperation and anxiety. "Dad, I got a letter from a lawyer. Seriously? Are you suing us? This is insane. It was an accident." "It was not an accident, Thomas," I said, my voice calm and even. I was practicing the detachment Jensen had advised. "An accident is knocking a glass off a table. What Veronica did was deliberate, and your presence is requested at the meeting. It's an opportunity to resolve this without going to court." "Resolve what? Veronica already told you she's bought you a new one. It cost almost $1,000. What more do you want?" he pleaded, his voice cracking. $1,000. The number was so pitifully small compared to the reality that it was almost comical. "The violin she bought is irrelevant, Thomas," I said. "Just be at the meeting, that's all." I hung up before he could argue further. The week leading up to the meeting was one of the longest of my life. I was a bundle of nerves and cold resolve. I spent my days in a haze, the silence of the apartment a constant reminder of my loss. I packed the remains of the violin into a specially prepared case Julian Croft had left for me, each piece nestled in custom-cut foam. It felt like packing a coffin. Veronica, true to form, sent another text message. "I can't believe you're doing this, Arthur, after everything we've done for you, trying to help you. This is the thanks we get? A threatening letter from a lawyer? You are being incredibly selfish and vindictive, but fine, we will be there, and you will see how ridiculous you are being. Everything we've done for you." The sheer audacity of that statement fueled the fire of my resolve. Her version of reality was so warped, so completely self-serving, that she was incapable of seeing her own culpability. She was the victim. I was the aggressor. In her mind, this meeting was about her putting me back in my place. The day of the meeting arrived, gray and overcast, matching my mood. I dressed in my best suit, a dark gray wool that I hadn't worn since Eleanor's funeral. It felt appropriate. I was mourning a death, and I was attending a funeral, the funeral of my relationship with my son and his wife. Arthur Jensen's office was on the top floor of a downtown skyscraper. The reception area was a study in understated power, mahogany walls, leather armchairs, and a view that stretched across the entire city. It was designed to intimidate. I was shown into a large conference room. A long, polished mahogany table dominated the space. Jensen was already there, standing by the window, looking out at the city. He turned as I entered, and his stern face broke into a small, reassuring smile. "Arthur," he said, shaking my hand warmly, "you ready for this?" "As I'll ever be," I said, my voice tight. "Good. Remember the plan. Say as little as possible. Let me do the talking. You are the aggrieved party. You are here, calmly and reasonably, seeking justice. Let her be the one to lose control. She will. People like that always do." He gestured for me to sit on one side of the table. In front of my seat was a single file folder. On the other side of the table, 2 empty chairs waited. The large, custom case containing the violin's remains rested on the floor beside my chair. We waited in silence for 10 minutes. It was a deliberate strategy, Jensen had told me. Make them wait. Let their anxiety build. Finally, the door opened, and a receptionist showed them in. Thomas looked pale and drawn, his eyes avoiding mine. He looked like a man being led to the gallows. Veronica, however, was a portrait of defiant arrogance. She wore a sharp, expensive-looking business suit, her hair perfectly coiffed, her makeup immaculate. She looked as though she were attending a hostile takeover, not a family mediation. She strode to the table and sat down, placing her designer handbag firmly on its surface. "Well," she said, her voice sharp and impatient. "We're here. Let's get this farce over with. We have a lunch reservation." Jensen sat down opposite her, steepling his fingers. He regarded her with a calm, almost professorial air. He didn't say a word for a full 30 seconds, letting her rude opening statement hang in the air and curdle. "Okay. Thank you for coming, Mr. and Mrs. Vance," he said finally, his voice smooth and professional. "My name is Arthur Jensen. I am representing my client, Mr. Arthur Vance, in the matter of the property destroyed at his residence on the afternoon of..." He consulted a paper. October the 12th. Veronica scoffed. Property destroyed. You mean that old violin? For God's sake, I lost my temper. It was a mistake. I've apologized. I've bought him a replacement. A very generous one, I might add. This is nothing but a shakedown. Jensen ignored her outburst. He turned his calm gaze to Thomas. Mr. Vance, do you dispute the sequence of events? That your wife, Veronica Vance, willfully and deliberately smashed the violin belonging to your father? Thomas swallowed hard, his eyes darting from Jensen to his wife, then to me. Well, willfully. I mean, she was angry. She wasn't thinking straight. It wasn't premeditated. I'm not asking for a psychological evaluation, Jensen said, his voice hardening slightly. I'm asking if she did it on purpose. Did she intend to strike the violin against the table, or did she trip and fall while holding it? The question hung in the air, stark and simple. Thomas squirmed. She intended to hit it, he mumbled, his voice barely audible. But she didn't know. Thank you, Jensen said, cutting him off. That's all I need on that point. The act was intentional. The consequences are what we are here to discuss. He slid a single sheet of paper across the polished table towards them. It was a photograph, a clear, high-resolution 8x10 photograph of the shattered violin laid out on my dining table. Veronica glanced at it dismissively. Yes, it's broken. We get it. What is the point of this? The point, Jensen said, his voice dropping to a lower, more serious register, is to establish the object in question. Now, Mrs. Vance, you have repeatedly referred to this object as an old violin, as trash, and as firewood. You operated under the assumption that it was of little to no monetary value. Is that correct? Of course it is, she said haughtily. Look at it. It was old and falling apart. Arthur never took care of anything. I felt a flash of hot anger, but I caught Jensen's eye. He gave a tiny, almost imperceptible shake of his head. I stayed silent, clenching my fists under the table. I see, Jensen said. He opened the file folder in front of him. That is where you have made a grave, and very, very expensive, miscalculation. He took out a document and slid it across the table to join the photograph. It was a copy of the original appraisal from London, the one Eleanor had commissioned. This, Jensen said, is a preliminary appraisal of the instrument conducted over 10 years ago. Please, take a look. Thomas picked it up. Veronica leaned over his shoulder to read it. I watched her face. I saw her eyes scan the text. I saw the moment she read the name Guarnery del Gesù. There was no reaction. The name meant nothing to her. She continued reading, her expression one of bored impatience. This is just a bunch of technical jargon, she said, tossing it back on the table. What's your point? Jensen smiled, a thin, cold smile that didn't reach his eyes. My point, Mrs. Vance, is that ignorance is not a legal defense. You are correct. The name Guarnery probably means nothing to you. So allow me to translate. He took another document from his file. This is the report I commissioned from Mr. Julian Croft of Croft & Son, arguably the world's leading authority on instruments of this kind. He flew here from London to personally inspect the remains. He paused, letting that sink in. I saw a flicker of uncertainty in Veronica's eyes for the first time. A man flew from London? Mr. Croft confirms the findings of the original appraisal. Jensen continued, his voice as steady and relentless as a drumbeat. The violin you destroyed was not trash, Mrs. Vance. It was a museum-quality historical artifact, crafted in 1741 by the man considered to be the greatest violin maker in history. It was one of fewer than 200 such instruments left in the world. He let the silence hang for a moment, watching them. Thomas had gone white as a sheet. Veronica was staring at Jensen, her mouth slightly open, a look of disbelief warring with her ingrained arrogance. And now, Jensen said, his voice quiet but carrying immense weight, we come to the central issue, the issue of restitution. The very expensive $1,000 replacement you ordered does not quite cover the loss. He took out the final document. It was a single page. He didn't slide it across the table. He held it in his hand. Mr. Croft's report includes a formal valuation based on current market conditions, recent auction results for comparable instruments, and the specific provenance and condition of this particular violin before you destroyed it, Jensen said, His eyes locked on Veronica. The valuation is, in his professional opinion, conservative. He placed the paper on the table in front of them, face up. There was only one thing written in the center of the page, in a large, bold font. Fair market valuation, $2,200,000. The number sat on the table like a bomb. For a moment, there was absolute, stunned silence. The only sound was the faint hum of the building's ventilation system. Thomas stared at the paper as if it were a venomous snake. His face, already pale, seemed to collapse. Veronica, however, reacted differently. At first, she just stared. Her perfectly made-up face was a blank mask of incomprehension. She blinked once, then twice. She looked from the paper to Jensen, then to me, then back to the paper. And then she laughed. It was not a pleasant sound. It was a high, hysterical shriek of a laugh, laced with panic and disbelief. $2 million? She gasped, clutching her chest. You're insane. You're all insane. This is a joke. This is the most ridiculous, pathetic bluff I have ever seen. Jensen did not smile. He simply waited. $2.2 million for a dusty old fiddle? She shrieked, her voice rising with every word. No one would ever pay that. You just made that up. You hired some fake expert from London to write you a fantasy number. Mr. Croft, Jensen said calmly, is the man the world's largest auction houses and insurance firms consult before they handle a $17 million Stradivarius. His expert testimony has been accepted in the High Court of London and the Supreme Court of New York. He is, I assure you, quite real, as is the valuation. The reality of the situation began to penetrate her hysteria. The color drained from her face. The laughter died in her throat, replaced by a strangled gasp. No, she whispered, shaking her head. No, it can't be. She looked at me, her eyes wide with a dawning animal terror. Arthur, tell them it's a lie. It was just your old violin. It was from a junk shop. I looked at her, and for the first time in that room, I spoke. My voice was quiet, devoid of passion, a simple statement of fact. Eleanor bought it from an antique shop, Veronica, not a junk shop. She knew what it was. She just never told me the price. She wanted me to love it for its music. My words, simple and true, seemed to be the final blow. The last vestiges of her defiance crumbled. The carefully constructed world of Veronica Vance, a world built on arrogance, entitlement, and the intimidation of others, shattered in an instant, just as surely as she had shattered the violin. $2 million, she whispered again, the number a death knell. She turned to Thomas, her hands trembling. Thomas, do something. Say something. We don't have that kind of money. We can't. Thomas looked at the paper, then at his wife, then at me. His face was a mask of utter devastation. He looked like a man who had just watched his entire life burn to the ground. You did this, he said, his voice a choked, broken whisper. You did this. I told you to stop. I told you to leave it alone. Me? She screeched, turning on him with the fury of a cornered animal. You just stood there. You let him do this to us. You're weak. You've always been weak. I'm weak, he shot back, a spark of life, of anger, finally igniting in his eyes. I have spent 15 years trying to keep the peace, trying to clean up your messes, trying to stop you from running over everyone in your path. I told you to leave my father alone, but you couldn't, could you? You just had to push and push and push. This is your fault, she screamed, pointing a shaking finger at me. You and your precious, stupid violin, you did this to ruin me. Mrs. Vance, Jensen interjected, his voice cutting through her hysteria like a scalpel. My client did nothing but sit in his own home. You entered his home. You destroyed his property. The consequences of that action are yours, and yours alone. The valuation is not a negotiating point. It is the debt you owe. We are here today to discuss how you intend to pay it. Pay it. The word hung in the air. Veronica stared at him, her mind clearly racing, trying to find an escape route where there was none. The bravado, the anger, the defiance, it all melted away, replaced by a raw, primal panic. We can't, she whimpered, the fight completely gone from her. She looked small and pathetic in her expensive suit. We don't have anything near that. We have the house, A mortgage on the house. The cars are leased. We have some savings, but nothing. Nothing like that. Her composure finally, utterly shattered. She dropped her head into her hands and began to sob. Not quiet, regretful tears, but loud, ugly, gulping sobs of pure self-pity. It was the sound of a spoiled child who has finally been told no in a way they cannot argue with. Jensen looked at her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he turned to Thomas. "Mr. Vance, your wife is indisposed. Perhaps you and I can have a rational discussion. My client is prepared to accept a structured settlement. It will involve the immediate liquidation of all your significant assets. Your house, your cars, your investment portfolios, your savings, everything. What remains of the debt after that can be paid via a garnishment of your future wages. It will be a long and difficult road, but it is the only road available, short of a court judgment and a declaration of bankruptcy, which I assure you will be far more unpleasant." Thomas just sat there, numb, staring into the middle distance. He nodded slowly, like a man in a dream. "The house," he whispered. "Everything." The scene was surreal. The powerful, intimidating woman who had terrorized my life for years was now a sobbing, broken mess. My son, who had always stood by her, was now facing the complete ruin of the life she had built for them. And me? I felt nothing, no triumph, no joy, just a vast, empty quiet. I had wanted justice, and this was what it looked like. It was ugly and sad and pathetic. Jensen stood up. "I will give you a few moments to speak with your wife," he said to Thomas. "A colleague of mine will be in shortly with the preliminary settlement documents. I advise you to sign them. If you choose not to, we will be filing a civil suit for the full amount, plus damages and legal fees, by the end of business today." He walked over to me and placed a hand on my shoulder. "Let's get some air, Arthur," he said quietly. He led me out of the conference room, leaving them alone with the $2.2 million piece of paper and the wreckage of their lives. As the door closed behind us, I heard Veronica's sobs escalate into a desperate, wailing cry. It was not the sound of remorse. It was the sound of loss, the loss of money, of status, of a life she had taken for granted. She wasn't crying for the violin. She was crying for her handbag. In the hallway, the thick carpet absorbed all sound. The silence was a relief. Arthur Jensen led me to his private office, a corner room with stunning panoramic views. He poured 2 glasses of water from a pitcher on his desk and handed one to me. My hand was perfectly steady. "Well," he said, taking a sip, "that went more or less as expected." "She collapsed," I said, the image of Veronica's breakdown replaying in my mind. "Completely." "Hubris is a fragile fortress, Arthur," he said, looking out the window. "It's built on the assumption that the world will always bend to your will. The moment it's confronted with an immovable object, in this case, a verifiable 7-figure debt, it shatters. She has spent her life bullying and intimidating her way to what she wants. She has never faced a consequence she couldn't talk her way out of. Until today." I sank into one of the leather chairs opposite his desk, the adrenaline of the confrontation slowly draining away, leaving a profound weariness in its place. "And Thomas," I said, my voice heavy. "He just gave up." "What choice did he have?" Jensen replied, turning back to me. "The evidence is undeniable. The debt is real. He is legally and financially entangled with her. For the first time, he saw the true cost of his passivity. The life he thought he had was a house of cards, and his wife just lit the match. All he can do now is watch it burn." We sat in silence for a few minutes, the distant sounds of the city a low hum below us. I thought of my son. I thought of the bright, happy boy he had been, before he had met Veronica, before he had learned to trade his own convictions for a quiet life. I felt a pang of sorrow for that boy, a grief that was separate from the anger I felt towards the man he had become. A junior lawyer, a young man with a serious face, knocked softly and entered. "Mr. Jensen, they've signed the preliminary agreement," he reported. "They've asked to consult their own counsel before the final papers are drawn, which we expected. Mrs. Vance is quite distraught. Mr. Vance is arranging for them to leave." "Thank you, Michael," Jensen said. "Begin the process of asset verification immediately. I want a full accounting of everything they own by tomorrow morning." The young man nodded and left, closing the door softly behind him. The consequences were now set in motion. A legal machine had been activated, and it would grind forward with relentless efficiency. Their beautiful mortgage-to-the-hilt house would be put on the market. The leased luxury cars would be returned. Their savings would be drained, their investments liquidated. They were about to learn a very hard lesson in the difference between perceived wealth and actual net worth. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out. It was a call from Thomas. I looked at the screen, then back at Jensen. He just nodded, his expression neutral. I let it go to voicemail. I was not ready to speak to him. Not yet. A few minutes later, a text message appeared. It was from the same unknown number Veronica had used before. I opened it with a sense of detached curiosity. "You've ruined us," it read. Just that. No apology. No remorse. Just the raw, bitter accusation. She still saw herself as the victim. Even now, faced with the catastrophic consequences of her own actions, she could not see past her own selfish perspective. She had destroyed a priceless piece of history, a symbol of my deepest love, and in her mind, I was the one who had wronged her. I showed the text to Jensen. He read it and gave a short, mirthless laugh. "Of course," he said, "narcissists never believe they are the problem. The problem is always the world, for not conforming to their desires. Save that text, Arthur. It's a lovely little bow on top of our case, should she ever decide to challenge this." I left Jensen's office an hour later. The sky had opened up, and a cold rain was falling, washing the city streets clean. I stood under the building's awning, watching the traffic hiss by, the world seeming both familiar and alien. I had won. I had achieved the justice I set out to get. The financial restitution would be immense. Veronica's reign of terror was over. So why did I feel so empty? This wasn't a victory to be celebrated. It was a tragedy to be endured. A family had been irrevocably broken. A son had been lost to me, perhaps forever. And no amount of money, no matter how vast, could bring back the violin. No settlement could restore the music that had been silenced. I walked home in the rain, letting the cold drops soak my suit. By the time I reached my apartment building, I was drenched. I let myself into my quiet home. The dining table was empty now. The gruesome display of the violin's remains gone. But its absence was a presence in itself, a gaping hole in the fabric of the room. I went to my armchair and sat down. I looked at the empty space where the violin case used to be. The quiet decision I had made in my grief had led me down this path, and I had seen it through to its conclusion. I had stood up for myself, for Eleanor, for the memory of what had been desecrated. I had done what was right. But the peace I had hoped to find in that justice was not there. All I felt was the profound, aching silence where the music used to be. The fight was over. The long, slow process of grieving and of figuring out what to do with the wreckage, both of the violin and of my family, was just beginning. Later that night, the phone rang again. It was Thomas. This time, I answered. "Dad?" His voice was hollow, fragile. "Thomas," I said. We're going to lose the house," he said, his voice breaking. "We're going to lose everything." "I know," I said quietly. "Is this what you wanted?" he asked, a note of desperate pleading in his voice. "To destroy us? Is the money that important to you?" I took a deep breath. "It was never about the money, Thomas," I said, my voice low and steady. "You still don't understand. It was about respect. It was about a lifetime of disrespect, from her and from you, for letting it happen. The violin was just the final straw. The money is just the clumsy language the law uses to measure the scale of that disrespect. She broke something priceless. The law can only assign it a price. This is the consequence. It's not a punishment I created. It's a debt she incurred." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. I could hear his ragged breathing. "What do we do now?" he whispered. "You do what the settlement says," I replied. "You pay the debt, and you figure out how to live with the choices you both made." "And you, Dad? What about you and me?" The question hung between us, heavy with years of unspoken words, of disappointment, and of a stubborn, resilient love. "I don't know, Thomas," I said, and it was the most honest thing I had said all day. I truly don't know. I ended the call, leaving the question and the future unanswered. In the weeks that followed, the legal machinery put in place by Arthur Jensen moved with grim efficiency. A team of accountants and real estate agents descended upon Thomas and Veronica's life, cataloging, valuing, and preparing everything for liquidation. The life they had presented to the world, a life of effortless suburban affluence, was revealed to be a fragile facade built on a mountain of debt. The large, modern house with its perfectly manicured lawn was put on the market at a price designed for a quick sale. The two luxury vehicles, both leased, were returned to the dealerships. Veronica's collection of designer handbags, her jewelry, the expensive art prints on their walls, all of it was appraised by a consignment firm. It turned out that most of it was fake, high-quality replicas purchased on trips abroad. The discovery was a pathetic and telling detail. Even her presentation of wealth was a lie. I remained insulated from the process, receiving only periodic updates from Jensen. He told me that Thomas was cooperative, if numb, and defeated. Veronica, on the other hand, fought every step of the way. She argued with the real estate agent about the listing price. She tried to hide assets, moving money into a new account under her maiden name, an act that was quickly discovered and only made her legal situation worse. She was, as Jensen put it, thrashing like a hooked fish, refusing to accept her fate. They were forced to move out of their house and into a small, cramped rental apartment in a less desirable part of town. The fall from grace was swift, brutal, and public. Friends who had once flocked to their lavish parties now avoided their calls. The social circle that had been so important to Veronica evaporated overnight, proving to be as superficial as her counterfeit handbags. One evening, about a month after the meeting, my doorbell rang. It was not the impatient buzz of Veronica, but a soft, hesitant chime. I opened the door to find Thomas standing there, alone. He looked diminished. The expensive suit was gone, replaced by a simple jacket and jeans. There were dark circles under his eyes. He looked older, wearier. "Can I come in?" he asked, his voice quiet. I hesitated for a moment, then stepped aside. He walked into the living room and stood there awkwardly, his hands shoved in his pockets. He looked around the familiar room, his eyes lingering on the empty space by my armchair. "Veronica and I, we're separating," he said, his gaze fixed on the floor. "She blames me. She blames you. She blames everyone but herself. I can't live like that anymore. I can't live with the anger." I didn't know what to say. I just nodded. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," he continued, finally looking at me, "about everything. You were right. I let it happen. I always took the easy way out. I was so afraid of her anger, of the fights, that I just let her have her way. I thought I was keeping the peace, but I was just enabling her. I let her disrespect you, over and over again. And I stood by and did nothing when she did what she did." His voice broke, and he wiped at his eyes with the back of his hand. "I am so sorry, Dad. Not for the money, not for the house. I'm sorry for not being a better son. I'm sorry I didn't protect you, and I'm sorry I didn't protect Eleanor's memory." It was the apology I had been waiting years to hear. It was genuine, heartfelt, and stripped of any excuses. It was the apology of a man who had finally been forced to look at himself in the mirror and had not liked what he saw. "I'm moving into a small place on my own," he said. "The wage garnishment will start next month. It's going to be a long time, but it's what I have to do. It's what we owe." I walked over to him, and for the first time in years, I put my arms around my son. He was stiff at first, then he sagged against me, and I felt his shoulders shake with silent sobs. I held him, the father in me finally overpowering the anger and the hurt. He was still my son, flawed, weak, but my son. And he had lost his way. Perhaps now he was finally on the path to finding it again. A few months passed. The sale of the house closed. After paying off the large mortgage and all the associated fees, the remaining equity, along with their liquidated savings and investments, was transferred to a trust account set up by Jensen. It was a substantial sum, but it was less than half of the total debt. The rest would be paid by Thomas, bit by bit, over the next 2 decades. I didn't touch the money. It sat in the trust account, an abstract number on a bank statement. It felt like blood money. It was the price of my pain, and I wanted nothing to do with it for myself. But Julian Croft's words echoed in my mind. A crime against culture. The violin was gone. Its voice was silenced. But perhaps from its ashes, other voices could be nurtured. I met with Arthur Jensen again. I know what I want to do with the money, I told him. We spent the next several weeks working with a team of financial advisors and philanthropists. We established a foundation, the Eleanor Vance Foundation for Young Musicians. Its mission was simple, to provide funding, instruments, and mentorship to gifted young musicians from underprivileged backgrounds who could not otherwise afford to pursue their art. The initial sum from the settlement became the foundation's seed money. I added my own life savings to it. We established a board of directors, including a professor from the local conservatory and a first-chair cellist from the city orchestra. The first act of the foundation was to acquire a fine instrument, not a Guarneri, but a beautiful 19th century Italian violin with a warm, rich tone. It was to be the foundation's loaner instrument, passed from one scholarship recipient to the next. Our first scholarship was awarded to a young girl named Maya. She was 16, the daughter of immigrants, and she played with a passion and a raw talent that was breathtaking. She had been playing on a cheap, factory-made instrument that buzzed and fought her at every turn. I attended the small ceremony at the conservatory, where she was presented with the scholarship and the violin. She held the instrument with a reverence that brought tears to my eyes. She drew the bow across the strings, and a pure, soaring note filled the room. It was a sound of such profound beauty, a sound of a voice finally set free. In that note, I heard an echo of my own lost violin. The music hadn't died. It had just been transformed. It was no longer my solitary comfort. It was now a legacy, a gift to a new generation, given in Eleanor's name. I found a new rhythm to my days. I was busy, attending board meetings, reviewing scholarship applications, going to student recitals. The silence in my apartment was no longer oppressive. It was just quiet. Thomas and I began to slowly, cautiously rebuild our relationship. He would come over for dinner once a week. We didn't talk about Veronica or the past. We talked about books, about music, about his work. He was quieter now, more thoughtful. The loss of his material wealth seemed to have stripped him down to his essential self, and I found that I liked that person much more. He told me Leo was living with him part-time and was having a difficult time adjusting, but that for the first time, they were actually talking to each other. One evening, as I was preparing to leave for a foundation event, my phone rang. It was an unknown number. I almost ignored it, but something made me answer. Hello? A woman's voice, one I barely recognized, answered. It was thin, reedy, stripped of all its former arrogance. Arthur? It was Veronica. I was silent. I heard about the foundation, she said. What you're doing for Eleanor. Yes, I said, my voice neutral. It's a good thing, she said. I wanted to say, I'm sorry. The words sounded strange and foreign, coming from her lips. I'm sorry for the violin, she continued, her voice trembling. I was angry, and I was jealous of you, of your life, of what you had with her. It was so simple, and you were so content. And I wasn't. I thought, if I could just change everything, get you to sell the apartment, get the money, I thought it would make me happy. It was ugly. I was ugly. It was the confession I had never expected to hear. It was raw, pathetic, and for the first time, it sounded true. I've lost everything, Arthur, she whispered. Thomas, Leo, my whole life. I'm working a retail job now. It's humbling. I listened, the anger I had held for so long finally, completely dissolving. It was replaced by a kind of weary pity. She was not a monster. She was just a broken, unhappy person who had caused a tidal wave of destruction out of her own emptiness. Her punishment was not the loss of her house or her money. It was being forced to live with herself, stripped of all the illusions she had used to hide from her own misery. I hope you find some peace, Veronica, I said, and I meant it. You too, Arthur, she whispered. Goodbye. She hung up. I stood there for a moment, the phone in my hand. It was over. Truly over. a final, quiet closing of a painful chapter. I put on my coat and headed out into the cool night air. I was on my way to a concert, the first public performance of the Eleanor Vance Foundation's first scholarship recipient. As I walked, I thought about the nature of value. Veronica had thought value was measured in dollars, in designer labels, in the square footage of a house. She had destroyed something she thought was worthless, and had been ruined by a value she couldn't comprehend. I had learned that true value lies elsewhere. It lies in love, in memory, in the beauty of a soaring melody. It lies in the legacy we leave behind, not in the assets we accumulate. The violin was gone, a casualty of ignorance and greed. But Eleanor's love, the love that had brought it into my life, had been transformed into a new kind of music, a music that would play on in the hands of young people for years to come. I entered the warm, bright concert hall and found my seat. The lights went down. Maya walked onto the stage, the violin tucked under her chin. She looked out into the audience, and for a moment, her eyes met mine. She smiled, a small, grateful smile. Then she closed her eyes, took a breath, and began to play. And the music, beautiful and resilient, filled the silence.